Welcome everyone, my name is Scott and welcome back to this tutorial series on building a space shooter game with Phaser 3. In our last video, we went ahead and worked on adding a new spawner component, so then that way we can create an object pool to have multiple enemies in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the description to the source code to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if they catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so before we start working on our next component, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and address a bug in our code tied to our overlap checks. And so currently, after our player is destroyed, what happens is our physics body still checks for overlaps between our player and our enemy game objects. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a safeguard to our overlap check in our game scene, and then that way if our objects are not active, we won't actually call our logic to go ahead and destroy the enemy ships or the bullets. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go into our overlap code here, and we're just going to do if our player game object active, so we're going to say if our player game object is not active or the enemy game object is not active, then we'll just go ahead and return early. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do our existing logic. So we're just going to copy this here. Let's paste it down here. And so that covers our groups. And now we want to go ahead and do the same thing down here when we check for the overlap between our enemy's weapon pool and our player. And so we'll have our player game object, and we want to change this to our projectile game object. We're going to copy that. Let's come down to where we check for our player collision with our player's weapons and the enemies. And so we'll have our enemy game object if it's not active, or our projectile. And one more time for our other group, we'll go ahead and save. So now if we go ahead and have our player get destroyed, let's go ahead and stay here in the middle. What should happen now is now when another object, so like these bullets here, they should go through our collider and our enemy should not get destroyed. So now that we fixed that bug, now we're going to go ahead and start working on our next component. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create another spawner component, and this one's going to be used for spawning explosions in our game. And basically what we're going to do is anytime one of our enemies are destroyed, we're going to spawn a new game object in that position, and it's just going to go ahead and play our explosion animation. And so these are going to be basic sprites that don't have any colliders tied to them. And so by doing this, it allows us to separate our object pool for our active enemies and our object pool for our explosions. And so this will be nice because when one of our enemies are destroyed, we immediately set it to not active. And what will happen is if we want to do our explosion at that point, we need to leave our enemy active but not have it move, and it starts to add some complexities to our code. By decoupling the two, we can have the two separate object pools, but we'll still have a really nice in-game effect, just with that extra game object. And so for this component, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to listen for our custom event for when an enemy dies, and then that's going to be used to trigger the creation of this new game object. And so to go ahead and do this, let's come over to our code. And under our source folder, let's go into our components under spawners, and we'll go ahead and add a new spawner component. And so what we're going to do, we're going to call this enemy destroy component. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and export our class. We'll export class. We'll do enemy destroyed component. Let's add in our constructor. And so for this component, what we'll need is we'll need our phaser scene for we want to go ahead and create our phaser group. So we'll have scene for one of our arguments, and then we'll also need our event bus component, so that way we can add that event listener. So we'll go ahead and add an event bus component, and then what we'll do is let's add both of these as properties to our scene. So we'll have our scene. We'll also have our phaser group for our object pool, and then we'll have our event bus component. So now what we'll do in our constructor, let's go ahead and assign these out. So we'll have our scene will be equal to the scene we provide. Our event bus component will be equal to our event bus component. And now we want to go ahead and create our phaser group. So we'll go ahead and do this. Group will be equal to our scene. We'll use the add method and we'll do group. Now we need our configuration. And so for our configuration, the only thing we're going to go ahead and use is name. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to our enemy spawner component. I'm going to copy this here. We'll add it to our name. All right, so what we're doing here is we're creating a basic phaser group. And the reason we're not using a physics group is by default, if we don't provide a class we want to use for when we create our game objects, phaser is going to go ahead and use a sprite game object for us. And for these explosions, we don't need any physics tied to them. They don't need a physics body. And so by using a regular group, we'll just create a regular sprite. And then we don't have to worry about physics being applied to them. All we care about is the animation component for that game object. So now that we have our group, now we need to go ahead and listen for our events. We'll do our event bus component, we'll do on, and let's go ahead and do our custom events. And we want to do enemy destroyed. So when our enemy is destroyed, we'll receive an instance of our enemy, and we'll have to add in this logic. And so once we have our enemy, now what we want to do is we need to grab a game object from our group. So what we'll do is we're just going to store that in a variable. So we'll do const, we'll do our game object is going to be equal to our group. We're going to use the get method. And now we want to go ahead and provide our X and Y value for where we want this game object to spawn in our game. And so we're going to use our enemy object as provided. So then that way we have the same X and Y position. And then we're also going to reference the texture that's currently applied to the enemy that was destroyed. And so for that, we're going to need to add a new property that we can reference to get that asset key. And so, because currently our scout and our fighter use different assets, and we just want to go ahead and grab that from that class. And then we want to go ahead and use a frame. And so currently for both of our game objects, it's set up to use just the default frame. If we ever had a single sprite sheet with multiple frames, we would have to go ahead and refactor this so we can actually grab that frame from our class. But for the time being, this will work. So after we spawn our game object and we now have what ship it should look like, now we need to go ahead and play our animation. And so we're just going to go ahead and do play. Now we need to provide our configuration, so we'll have our animation key. And similar to like what we did before, now we need to know which animation asset key should be tied to the game object that was destroyed. So we're going to add this to our enemy classes as well, so then we have it for a reference. And so we're going to call this ship destroyed animation key. All right, so since we did that, let's go ahead and add these two getters to our two classes so then we have them available. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to jump over to our fighter class first. So we'll have our fighter enemy. I'm going to come down to the rest of our getters, and I'm going to do get. We'll have our ship asset key. And so for this, we're just going to go ahead and return fighter, since that's the asset key we're using when we create our main ship sprite. I'm going to copy this and paste it. And now we just want to go ahead and do our other getter. So we're going to go ahead and do our ship destroyed animation key. We'll have get ship destroyed animation key. And now for this, we want fighter and then destroy. And so these are just the asset keys that we have listed inside our data file for animations. We'll see that for each of our ship types, we have some type of destroy animation tied to them. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy both of these. Let's jump over to our scout enemy class, and we're going to go ahead and paste those getters here. And now we just need to go ahead and update our references. So it's just going to be scout, and we'll have scout destroy. So now the next thing we'll need to do for our destroy component to work is we need to go ahead and actually emit this enemy destroyed event when our game object's actually destroyed. So let's jump over to our fighter enemy class, and what we're going to do is in our update method, when we have our check here to see if our game object is now dead, what we want to go ahead and do is we want to go ahead and play our animation. And so now what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and use that event bus component that we assigned in our init method here. So what we'll do is we're going to do this. We'll reference our event bus component, and we're going to do emit. And now we're going to go ahead and do our custom events, and we want to do enemy destroyed. Now we're going to pass in this as a reference, so then that way this instance of our fighter enemy will be available to our component here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to copy this. Let's jump over to our scout enemy class, and similar thing, when our health component shows it's dead, we're going to go ahead and emit this event. So now we finished updating our enemies to go ahead and emit our new event. What we're going to go ahead and do next is now we need to go ahead and create an instance of our enemy destroy component. So what we'll do is let's go ahead and jump over to our game scene. And then what we'll do is after we create our enemy spawn components, we'll go ahead and make a new component. So we're going to go ahead and do new. We're going to do our enemy destroy component. And so for this, we'll pass in our scene. And then we'll go ahead and pass in our event bus component. All right, so now we're going to save. We should be able to test our changes. So in our game, let's go ahead and try destroying an enemy ship. All right, we'll see when our enemy's destroyed. We play an explosion animation right where the enemy was. And now if we check our console log, we'll see even though we're destroying our enemy game objects, we're still only spawning those same two game objects and we're reusing them. All right, so then one more test. We're going to go ahead and let the enemy ship go ahead and collide with us, and that should cause the enemy to explode, and our ship should explode as well. All right, so one last change we're going to go ahead and make to our game is we're going to go ahead and turn off our debug. Since we've tested our collisions, we're going to go ahead and turn off our purple boxes. So we come into our main.js. Let's go ahead and set our debug to false. Now we should be able to go ahead and test our game without our debug information. All right, with that last change, that should bring this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to start on our UI and audio section. And so we'll start making enhancements to our game. We'll add like a scoring mechanic, player lives, audio, and we'll add some backgrounds to our scene. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.